Would you pray with me? Open our ears, O God, to hear your word and know your voice. Speak to our hearts and strengthen our wills, that we may serve you today, now, and always. Amen. How many of you, when you hear the name Moses, think of Charlton Heston? How many of you think of Mel Brooks? Okay. I'm not really trying to be irreverent. Well, maybe just a little. But isn't it incredible how the name Moses is recognizable and known by virtually all of us? And yet the story of Moses dates back to the 13th century BC. That's a long time ago. There's no question that Moses is arguably the most significant character in the Old Testament. He was a ruler, a judge, a lawgiver, a scribe, a teacher, a prophet, a healer, and the Savior for Israel. And he's written about in the first 5 books of the Bible, and 4 of them. He's in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and very much in Deuteronomy. He led the Israel out of slavery into Egypt and into Exodus. And he led them in the wilderness for 40 years. He spoke face to face to the God of Israel. He transmitted the 10 Commandments. And he's retained his prominence and his importance in both the Jewish and Christian traditions and imaginations throughout the ages, and including Islam. And he taught a whole new generation of Israelites the essentials of their faith, leaving behind a book written called the Book of Torah Law to be read and studied by each generation. And at the end, Moses was 120 years old. And then Yahweh told him that he wasn't going to get to cross the Jordan River and take the Israelites into the Promised Land. They'd had kind of a disagreement a while back. And so Yahweh said, Moses and Aaron, you don't get to go. And after he'd worked so hard, led them, and they were not easy people to lead, by the way, for 40 years in the wilderness, he said, you don't get to go. That's kind of daunting, isn't it? Can you imagine? And yet, however disappointed Moses was, his last words to the end of his life were focused on the Israelites and not himself. He told them to be strong and fearless, remembering that God would be with them at all times. And then he called Joshua over and said, Joshua, you're going to be the one who gets to take them into the Promised Land. Can you imagine? And he told the whole community, here's the one who's going to take you into the Promised Land. But until the very end of his life, Moses was obedient to God and loyal to the Israelites. So today, I want to talk just a bit about a smidge of that book of Torah law that we referenced, that Moses left behind. Because if Moses was the person that Moses was, then I'm thinking that it might be important even in 2023, as it was in the 13th century BCE. It's the book of Deuteronomy. That's where our reading came from. And the actual book of Deuteronomy is one long sermon. Aren't you glad that I only preach for like 15 or so minutes? Because, this is like 32 chapters. And the book of Deuteronomy begins as the Israelites are about to cross the Jordan River and enter the land that God had promised their ancestor Abraham. But just before that happens, just before the reading that we had today, Moses tells the Israelites that if they obey Yahweh, all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, meaning they will stay with you forever. So here we are at the end of Moses' ministry, and he's talking about obedience. You know, that's sometimes a hard word to hear. We might want to push back against it, or maybe I'm the only one. But that's kind of human nature, isn't it? We've been doing that pushing back since the beginning of time. But we need to remember that obedience is not all bad. Those who were obedient, like Moses talks about in the beginning of this reading, it wasn't about blind obedience, because it also meant teachable and compliant and willing to submit. I love that word, teachable. That's a part of being obedient. So the question is, does obedience hem us in, or does it free us? What's your experience been? You know, years ago, I had a dear friend teach me something. Took her 2 years, because I was, she told me one year, she said, Lynette, there is freedom in responsibility. And I said, okay. And then a year later, she said, you can have as much freedom as you're willing to be responsible for. So obedience is not all bad. And in these brief 15 to 20 verses we read today, we hear about choice, we hear about promise, and we hear about the consequences of those bad choices or those wrong choices. And Moses admonished the Israelites to choose life. I love that phrase, choose life. Because for Israel and for us, there's realities to our choices, aren't there? For Israel, the choices had greater impact than they do for us to a certain degree. They wanted a long future, and Yahweh was saying, if you're obedient, you're going to have a long future. If you're not, you may not. But the question is that any less true for us as we face this world today? Don't we want a long future? Not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And I know that, the Old Testament sometimes seems very prescriptive, very judgmental, but ancient life was full of consequences, and especially deadly consequences in this nomad tribal world of ancient Israel. That may not be our world, but we still live in a world where there are consequences of our behavior. And so what kind of consequences do we want? Well, that really depends on what kind of behavior we want to engage in. And Moses was asking them to make a covenant. That's a word that sometimes is used in law, but it's most often used in religious terms. It's about mutual love. And so he wanted them to make this covenant. And he promised them that if they would be obedient, time and time again, there would be blessings if they would keep this covenant. And so in reality, Moses was calling the Israelites to live the Torah as a way of life. As a way of life. Years ago, when I was young and searching for my first faith community, I wanted to find something that was a way of life. Even at 16. I can't explain why, but that's what I was seeking. I wanted something that was more than just coming to church on Sunday, but that would be a way of life. Now, I have to admit, I probably could have chosen better. the church I chose was not particularly fond of me over the years, but, we eventually straightened that out. But just like Moses calling to live the Torah as a way of life, God calls us to live our faith as a way of life. And this precious child who was so good, can I tell you, this precious child that we baptized today begins what we hope will be a lifelong relationship with the God of her understanding and with a community of faith. She begins it today. That's why we love to have baptisms in worship. That's why we ask and present the child to you. That's why we ask you to make promises. Because together we are beginning Tag's lifelong faith walk today. All of us. And we all have a part in it. And so haven't we been chosen to do that? Don't you feel like you've made that choice? Or you're just about to? But keep in mind, in spite of that choice, we're always free to exercise our will, aren't we? Always. And we're free to exercise it to either bring blessings upon ourselves and others or not. And in the middle of that, in the midst of our free will, what I find so incredibly powerful is that God remains faithful to us, despite our own behavior. Just like parents always remain faithful to their children, no matter what happens. And sometimes our choices are difficult, aren't they? Sometimes our choices bring about consequences that we don't like. They're inevitable because of our behavior, but they're difficult. And we kind of get that when it comes to the Israelites, because, they were way back when. And we kind of understand the concept of consequences in our children's lives. But we're not always so sure that consequences should have a real part in our adult life. Like we're kind of exempt or something, But sometimes it happens. We struggle with our marriage vows. We have secrets in families that harm us. We make financial decisions that impact many, many people. We have leadership in organizations that becomes problematic, both in church and in the secular world. So even as grown-ups, our choices have consequences. But here's the truth. Misfortune does not equal God's judgment. Let me repeat that. Misfortune does not equal God's judgment. And neither does abundance equal covenantal faithfulness. Sometimes it's just the result of our behavior. And sometimes it's the result of nothing we've done. But hear this, whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, God always wants the best for God's own creation. Amen. Of that I am absolutely sure. So today, in this precious baptism, every day moving forward, these parents will be faced with choices regarding this child. And as each year passes, that child will grow and be faced with choices of her own. Choices about choosing life, choosing obedience, listening, discerning. We are faced each day with that same dilemma of obedience, choosing life, listening, discerning. And we've been asked to love God with all our heart and mind and soul. But what does that look like every day? What does every day look like to be choosing life? Well, theologian Brett Yoger offers a myriad of what he calls sacred possibilities. Now, this list could go on, but here are these sacred possibilities of what it might look like for choosing life. Learn things you have told yourself you would never learn. Laugh often, loud and long. Cry when it's time to cry. Be patient with your own imperfections, as well as the imperfections of others. Surround yourself with what you love, whether it is family, friends, pets, music, nature, silence, or all of the above. Quit doing what is not worth your time. Stop arguing. Apologize to someone, even if it was mostly their fault. Figure out what you hope for and live with that hope. Don't let it go. Worship with all your heart. Pray genuinely. Love your church. Open your heart to the Spirit. Search for something deeper and better than your own comfort. Let God make your life wonderful. Over 3,000 years ago, Moses asked the Israelites to choose life. And the God who loves us, who created us, who sustains us, is asking us that still today, to choose life. May it be so.